Welcome and welcome to this session on payments for performance, key lessons and challenges for REDD. I think it will be a good session, and we want to make it such that you don't regret that you did pick this one and not one of the two others. That's the aim of this session. My name is Arild Angelsen. I'm a professor at the School of Economics at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, which is just 30 kilometers southeast of Oslo. I've also been working with C4 on the global comparative study on REDD and that project that you may know. Now, the format of this session is very much like you saw yesterday. We have 4 panelists here that will be given an opening questions and try to address that. Then we have a smaller discussion for roughly another half hour with more particular topics that will arise based on their early interventions. And then for the last at least 30 minutes, there will be some Q&A session here, so I hope you make good notes and put down questions here. Now, the topic of this is payments for performance. And a while ago, I think in 2008, I attended another seminar, and one of the participants asked that the key question for REDD is, why do we think it will work this time? We have tried for several decades to conserve forests, so what's new in REDD that really makes us believe that this time it's different? And having followed REDD discussion since about 2007, I think there are 2 things that are very different. One is the national approach that was very strong, particularly in the early days and less so now, that you need to have policy reforms. And I used to say that projects win battles, but policies win the war. And that's a topic that we're coming back to a little bit in the discussion, I hope. Now, the second was that it was going to be performance-based or result-based or output-based or cash on delivery or conditional payment. You can call the baby different things, but the key is that the payments to the relevant stakeholders is conditioned on some performance criteria that we have has been defined. And this was, I mean, as an economist like myself, it's not hard to argue that economic incentives are important and that cash is king, and really to, as the minister said yesterday, what we need to is to make a dead tree less valuable than a living tree. So that was to change the basic cost-benefit equation in favor of standing forests. And the second, it was also an equity argument that you should compensate those that undertake the real action. Those that really make an effort and get results, they also deserve to be paid and compensated for the cost involved. So performance-based, I would say, was a key of REDD. Of course, since then, this is difficult, and it's a much broader policy package involved in REDD, but this was really the key. And this is to be the focus of this session today. How can we get this to work? Meeting a nice theory meeting the reality on the ground. And not just to draw on the REDD experience, but this is something for those involved in the aid sector. It's been tried in particular health education that we'll hear some of the experience from. So how can it work? There should be a small PowerPoint. Here it is. So these are the speakers that I will introduce. The last one, Karl-Heinz Stecher, who could not make it because of illness, but we have 4 good panelists remaining that will make sure that we have a good discussion anyway. The key questions that I've posed here is what should REDD pay for, to whom and how? And try to split that into 3 things. One is the objectives of REDD. Should it be a focus on just carbon, or the more recent, that particularly in the UNFCCC negotiation is strong, the co-benefits or non-carbon benefits, as it's called more lately. The second is this performance criteria. At what stage in this whole result chain or the log frame should we intervene and define the performance criteria? Inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, impacts, and I think we'll hear more in it in just a couple of minutes. And the third, at what scale, which also relate to the question of actors. So these are kind of the fundamental questions. So if you want to implement this additional initial idea of REDD as performance-based. Now, there are a few dilemmas in additional to this. And I put up 4 points that will come back, so I don't even want to read them now, but we come back to them that are particularly challenging if you want to implement this nice theoretical idea. Now, to address this, the first speaker that I would like to introduce is William or Bill Savedoff from the Center for Global Development, where he has worked on issues particularly related to aid and health, which is, as I just mentioned, is one of the sectors where performance-based payments have been. Now, he just said that they came up with a nice acronym, the COD aid, and I just told him the COD aid is something Norway has a long experience in, from the 60s when we sent dried cod to Africa, to West Africa in particular, which is very good in protein. I think cod aid has gotten a different meaning, so I just want to clarify that misunderstanding. It's not about exporting fish. And he will take the first. And as you know, the Center for Global Development has been a strong advocate for this and doing good work on result-based or cash-on-delivery aid with Nancy Birdsell and others. So, welcome to you.
Thank you, Harold. I'm really pleased to be here. It's exciting for me, coming mostly from the health and education sectors, to be in a room where I'm learning 100% more every minute than I would from any other conferences, because everything's new. And the acronyms are new, and we actually were inspired by COD when we came up with the idea of cash-on-delivery aid. So it's good to be in Norway, where the idea originated. I also want to mention, I'm glad, we're really excited to have Frances Seymour joining us at the Center for Global Development. She's a really good fit because our president, Nancy Birdsall, talks about CGD being a think and do tank. We try to take ideas into action, and I think Frances is a good demonstration of how that happens. And because of her joining, Jonah Bush and others, we actually have a very dynamic forest initiative that's starting up now, and I hope we'll be hearing a lot about that in the next year to come. It's very exciting to come to this area of environmental work, because when I looked at performance-based work with Nancy Birdsall to come up with a cash-on-delivery aid book, it's an old idea. I mean, results-based management, payments for results have been coming for a long, long time. And one of the things that we were puzzled by was why they don't seem to work. And then when we started looking at the details of a lot of programs, we realized that a lot of times they were structured as if they were results-based programs, but they were really hybrids. They were paying for results on top of all the old software, as it were, of the aid agencies that had accumulated over decades. And so the idea of cash-on-delivery aid was to try to distill what is a real results-based program if you had started fresh without all the other accoutrements. I like starting with this diagram because a lot of times people talk about payments for results as if it were one thing. And at least along these two dimensions, it seems to us it's very important to distinguish what you're talking about when you're describing a payment for a result program, when you're trying to design it, or when you're trying to figure out if it's going to work or not. The programs can be aimed at individuals, households, firms, subnational authorities, or countries. In my world, we call that levels. In this world, I guess it's called scale. And also along the dimension of, are you paying for outcomes or outputs or inputs, somewhere along that chain. And you can see this is really important for a couple of different reasons. So I put at the individual level, there are programs in health where treating tuberculosis is a very long process. The person has to take certain kinds of drugs for a long time, 6 months, to get a complete treatment. And getting people to do that is actually quite hard. People start feeling better the first week or two after taking the drugs. They say, why should I keep taking this stuff? And they stop. So in health, they've started doing programs where they find ways to reward or encourage people to finish their TB treatments. And but the appropriate behavioral model for that is something that's related to human psychology, social psychology, behavioral economics, and things like that. Very different from something at the other extreme, which would be like COD8 or the Amazon Fund or budget support programs, which are trying to change or try to encourage performance at a government level. National governments don't behave like individuals. They're very different. So the model you have of how change is going to happen or what you're trying to achieve depends a lot on the scale, on the level. The other side, and this has been very dramatic for the health area, is that people are not very comfortable about paying for outcomes, about paying for the number of children who are educated, or a reduction in child mortality, largely because of the attribution issues, but also because they don't think it's, they don't want to put the money into verification of the indicators. So typically aid agencies work their way back. They say we can't pay for the outcomes, we'll pay for the outputs. We can't pay for the outputs, we'll pay for the inputs. And then suddenly you're back at a very traditional input-based aid program. So that's a dynamic that I think the environment area has to be concerned about. And so the key thing, I just close by saying that getting the design payments at the right level, as Harold pointed out, is very critical. I think that everything I've heard, the national level is really important for dealing with deforestation. Most of the causes, or most of the relationships between deforestation can be traced to things that are soy prices, foreign exchange policies, trade policies, enforcement. These seem to be things that are naturally have to be addressed at national and international levels. And I just want to say the other thing is that the biggest fallacy I come across is the idea that somehow we, meaning the international community, can make them, the recipient countries, do something. When we talk about payment for performance, we originally thought of it in terms of incentives, trying to encourage somebody to do something. But more and more, I really see it as changing the aid relationship or changing the flow of funds. By paying against a very clear indicator, you reduce the discretion of the donors in terms of they're just paying out against the indicator, and you change the focus of the recipient countries. But it's in a partnership relationship where the money then flows against the indicator, and then both parties are put into a situation of joint problem solving. We both want this outcome to improve. Then the money's, and the money's going to flow against that, but how can we jointly figure out the best ways to get that to happen? Thanks.
Thanks. I think there were several points that we could raise in discussion, but let me take the last thing, which you said that the biggest fallacy is that we, the West, think that we can get them to do something. But that's the idea of REDD, isn't it? International payments to make countries conserve more forest to avoid deforestation. So is the whole REDD idea a big fallacy?
I think that if you see it as we getting them to do something, then it's a non-starter. And I often like to go back to thinking about major changes we've made in human history, like ending slavery, or at least it's not considered a norm that anybody can accept anymore. I see REDD more as changing the international norms of what's acceptable or what's to be part of the international community. And so the payments, I would see them mostly as elevating the progress against deforestation to a very visible level. When you link money to something, it becomes much more visible than when you just have it as a report. And also linked to that idea of the compensation that's appropriate as a redistributive mechanism.
Good, and I think we come back to this, that was one of the kind of dilemmas I put up there, having these external incentives versus country ownership of the program that has been raised in the debate on performance-based payment. Our second speaker is, and I've practiced a little bit on correct pronunciation, Berta Pesti, just like in Budapest, I learned, which happened to be her hometown originally. But now based in Geneva, working for the UN REDD program. She's a lawyer by background, has worked in different NGOs, Red Cross and IUCN, or been, not worked, but been members of, for example, the IUCN Committee on Environmental Law, and also on LED, which is close to REDD. For those from East Africa that has a hard time to pronounce L and R, it's the same. but the low emission development strategies and also the NAMAs in various capacities. So we are happy to have you here and present some of your experiences from the UN REDD program.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy and pleased to be here with you, and I would like to present actually our experiences and our work that we're doing with different REDD countries. So I would definitely like to acknowledge the presence of some of the people that we work in, and I will use the experiences and the examples that we have developed together. So I just want to acknowledge their work. And basically, to start off and address this question of what REDD should pay for, where the payments should go, how, to whom, etc. I would like to start out with a very concrete example from the ground. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, under the leadership of the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Finance, the UN REDD program and UNDP are supporting the government to establish a national REDD Plus fund. And in this process, we actually have had to answer some of these questions and come up with solutions to these. So in the past 1 or 2 years, we have accumulated some experience, and there are 3 main points that I think are relevant in this discussion as introductions. And the first one is that this national fund and the national REDD Plus strategy of the country that it is supposed to be the implementation modality of does not have an exclusive carbon focus. And this is not only because the international negotiations, the UNFCCC, they put emission reductions in a sustainable development context, but also because for the government, the national REDD Plus strategy was a complementary tool to their sustainable rural development strategy. So because it is like that, the general objectives of the national strategy and its implementation modality, which is the fund, are actually quite broad. So the national fund has 3 general objectives, which are situated at the highest level of results, at the impacts, and it is expected to generate emission reductions, but it is also expected to contribute to poverty reduction and to the green economy. And this choice then has, of course, implications on the whole construction of the fund. It is becoming something very complex that has to accommodate many different things. And just to show you how it is actually reflected in the structure of this fund, it has 3 windows. And the first one is what we call a traditional ODA window that is going to make ex-ante payments for policy reforms and demonstration activities. We have a second window that is a payment for ecosystem services window, where we're expecting to reward agents based on their performance, but the indicators will be proxy indicators. And the third window is a carbon window where emission reductions will be rewarded. Currently, the government is developing the first window only. And actually, this leads to my second point that I would like to make here, is that we are using a step-by-step approach. We cannot go directly to performance-based payments. There are certain enabling conditions that have to be created that will be financed from this first window, and there are also methodologies and other procedural issues and learning that has to be done. And we are doing this by actually applying a rigorous results-based management approach to our first window as well. So results framework with indicators, but payments are made upfront. And then a third point that I think is relevant here is that because of the complexity of the fund and this very wide and broad impact and objectives that it tries to achieve, there are a really large diversity of actors who would be receiving payments from this fund. So one of the other challenges that we have had to face is how to create a fund that is able to, is open to these large diversity of actors. So the way it has been constructed is that it gives direct or indirect access to those agents of change, primarily to the countries, so national government, national NGOs, local beneficiaries in the future windows, but also to development partners such as the UN, such as multilateral development banks, so that they can complement and support the national efforts. So these are my 3 main points, I think, as a starting point. Not only carbon focus in this case, this results in a very broad scale of audience that we had to create structures to accommodate. And basically that also gave us the possibility to go step by step and start developing the first window. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I have several points that could be interesting to follow up. I think I save it for after all the presentations, including this kind of piecemeal payment for policy reforms, how that is being done, because we have several decades of experience of that I would like to come back to in the more general discussion. The third speaker, let's move to him. André Aquino works in the World Bank in Washington, D.C., but I presume you travel a lot like all the others. He's been there for 8 years, working in the carbon finance unit on both REDD and the sustainable land management issues, working across the 3 main continents of World Bank operation, but particularly focusing on Ethiopia and Indonesia that we're hearing more about today. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Similarly to Berta, actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about some experiences we are working in partnership with 2 main countries here, and I'm glad that they are well represented here, Indonesia and Ethiopia, actually. The experience is based on 2 instruments that the World Bank has been leading the implementation of. The Forest Carbon Partnership Facility Carbon Fund and the Biocarbon Fund, which is an older instrument. Both have the goal of piloting payments for REDD. So basically, really the ideal of REDD as the textbook says, right? The end payment for the result measured against the baseline. I'll be focusing on these 2 experiences where we are in practice trying to decide how this structure, how these payments will be and how they will be made against what and to whom. So the first thing is that I think we are talking about payments at 2 phases. One is the end phase, REDD, reduced emissions, and that's very clear. I think that's actually the ideal type of actually a performance-based payment, because the metrics is very clear. We can't disagree the focus on carbon or not, but it's very clear. And I think, Ariel mentioned that. This is one of the, in my opinion, the biggest innovation of REDD. At least we know very well what we need to measure it against. I think in the health sector, often it's not that easy, for instance. However, I think we are also talking about performance-based payments in a different way, output payments. So payments for a series of proxies that, in theory, would lead to emission reductions. This is very necessary in practice because of financial issues. The countries and programs need these initial payments to do the investments and policy changes that will lead to the emission reductions. So very quickly, how we are trying to do this in the case of Ethiopia. We have, that's the map we have here of Ethiopia. There is one regional state called Oromia, which as part of the national REDD process is being targeted for a landscape level program, REDD program. So basically the idea is that we are now analyzing drivers of deforestation in depth. But we would select a number of, let's call them milestones or triggers or indicators in the forest sector, in the livestock sector, in the agriculture sector, which are sectors that lead to deforestation. And associated to the meeting of some of these targets, payments would be made. So say, one of the major strategies of implementation of the REDD strategy in this region is participatory forest management, community forests. So basically, one indicator could be number of hectares under effective participatory forest management. And associated to that, there will be a trigger of payment. So that's what we are trying to do in the case of Ethiopia, bearing in mind that it's not only the forest sector. We would also be working on other sectors, agriculture productivity, livestock management practices, and so on. And in addition to these policy changes, so, I mean, land tenure, for instance, is always one area where we talk a lot about. The delivery of land certificates, for instance, to farmers, landholders, would be an important aspect of a REDD program. So potentially payments could also be delivered against that to the regional state. Now, Indonesia. Indonesia is a reflection, it's not really happening yet, but it's a reflection that has been going on for some time about how to compensate local level governments, district governments. As you know, in Indonesia, district governments they are powerful in land allocation. And as such, they are key players in how land is used. So the whole idea is to create incentives to local governments that would influence them in deciding how to use land in one way or the other. So again, we are working with some of the districts in identifying the triggers for these payments. Very important point here in the case of Indonesia is that the provinces, many of the provinces have already developed their REDD strategies. And in these REDD strategies, they have identified what these triggers could be. I mean, what the policy changes are that they would like to do to reduce emissions. So, and this goes to the issue of national ownership. What we are trying to do is to create an instrument that would implement what the national government actually has, well, what the local government actually has decided to do. I'll stop here and then we can get back.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. It also a few points that would be a good follow-up question, but I reserve that for after finishing the first round of this panel. Now the third speaker, or actually the fourth, is Dr. José Carlos Fernández from the Mario Molina Center, where you just joined as an economist. Before that, you have been working with the National Forestry Commission of Mexico and been the lead negotiator for REDD for the Mexican delegation in the UNFCCC. So you have both this background of being involved in negotiations and also being more an academic economist where you can think whatever you want. I guess you can think whatever you want as a negotiator as long as you don't say it. But and has worked in various capacities within the research institutes, being a lead environmental economist at the National Institute of Ecology, and have a good career in different places. So, welcome.
Thank you very much, and this is getting exciting. So I guess just to share with you a few initial comments. The first one is that we all want REDD to be results-based, but we're building REDD rules through traditional input-based support programs. In other words, what we are currently trying to do is to support readiness efforts through various interventions that are input-based. And that calls already for a shift in modality, how to shift from a system that is now very much input-based support into, let's say, transformational policies or whatnot, developing monitoring systems and other things, and gradually evolve into a results-based system that would be more hands-off. So I see that as a basic tension. that we need to keep in mind because we cannot have both. If we try to control inputs and outputs simultaneously, what we will end up is with an unmanageable high-cost regime. Mexico's had for a number of years a program of payment for environmental services that it's predicated on a results-based approach, and many people see that as a relevant reference for what REDD could be done, could evolve to. Now, having said that, I want to share how is it that we make that translation, because I think people sometimes think that there is an immediate translation of one program across scales, but I don't think there is. I guess what we are thinking of is that the principles behind PES development do apply across scales, but not the individual features. And let me give you an example. PES is predicated on clear rules, simple rules, so no land conversion, which is measured annually. And that clarity of rules across actors, I think, is what gives it a lot of its efficacy. So we have relevant monitoring and clear rules. Secondly, you have targeted payments to the key actors that can make a difference. In the case of PES, landowners. And finally, we give them sufficient flexibility on how is it that they are going to ensure internally how to prevent land conversion. Now, when you apply those principles to REDD, you come up with a different picture. You cannot go to the landowner, because the landowner is not necessarily the key actor, being able to address drivers of deforestation. The clarity in outcomes, I think, is there. We want carbon to be the key outcome. But we need carbon, which accounts for leakage, which accounts for permanence, and other things, unlike the light we have here. And then that already calls for a higher scale of actors, not the landowner, but a public entity. So, in other words, what we're thinking of in Mexico is a scheme that would be based on carbon outcomes, that would target payments to public entities, and that would be very much hands-off, that would very much give flexibility to public entities on how they actually translate REDD funding into national activities, something that the current PES program doesn't do at that scale. Now, having said that, something that was in some of the initial questions is what to do with co-benefits. And I think co-benefits is a tricky one. And I come back to Bill's comment that it's not about a very neutral incentive that you give out, but it's almost like developing new partnerships, joining efforts in a common good, in a common outcome. And having said that, the reality is that what we have right now is a multiplicity of donors, of drivers, motivators for countries to mobilize finance for REDD. And many of them go beyond carbon. Now, in addition, many co-benefits that are currently in REDD country programs are inputs into the production function of avoided reductions. In other words, improving livelihoods, improving governance is something worthwhile in itself, but at the same time, it also helps you reduce deforestation. So if we're going to measure that, if it's part of our goals, if it's within reach, I think it could be accommodated within REDD payments. Not mandatory, but we have to have some flexibility to accept that as part of this new partnership when and if it makes sense. And one final point I would say is that behind REDD incentives, there is a belief that actors can react effectively, can respond to those incentives. That countries can, in fact, adapt their behavior in ways that would make them perform better. And that really calls for governments to have sufficient policy analysis, sufficient policy intelligence to actually understand why is it that they are not performing or they could perform better. So an additional requirement, which is something that the PES scheme didn't have, is this notion of policy assessments as a key requirement as a key complement of any payment for results scheme.
Thanks a lot. A few good points. I would like to start with one that both the first and last speaker mentioned, that in a way you said you cannot both have input and output, and Bill said that what you see in maybe not the red sector but in the others is that you kind of mix it up, so you're getting hybrids. Now when you have hybrids you can either get the worst of both or the best of both. Or you may, also a third alternative is that it's just a result-based rhetorics that is there, but it's basically the same old type of input-based aid. So maybe, well, I invite all of them to comment, but maybe if you start just away from me here, no, with you and move away from me, that in the other sectors, how, if you have these hybrid systems, how did they work? Did it really? Did you get the worst of both worlds? I mean, nothing worked?
Things work, but I think they work much. Sorry. All my work is suggesting that separating these things is better. That these hybrids end up working at cross purposes. You either downgrade the results because you want to disperse the money against the inputs, and you don't get the outcome. So it's kind of like you're happy because the money went to where you wanted it to go, but you didn't get outcomes. Why would you be happy about that? Or they pay out against the outcomes, or they're expecting to pay out against the outcomes. I guess this is part of the problem with some of the early REDD payments. And then the small projects that are supposed to follow don't happen. And then the recipient country is very frustrated because they were supposed to be paid for this outcome, but the inputs, the disbursements aren't coming. So to me, the environmental, the one puzzling part about this conference to me is that I think you already have the agreement there. You pay out against reductions in deforestation at the national level, a payment that's fully, it goes to the treasury of the government. They can decide how they want to use that money. And all the other work which has to happen, I mean, these other projects are important, but the policy changes, the payment for environmental services at the local level, all these other things are things that the government should be taking the lead at. They're the ones who are responsible. And if they need help from external people, they can ask for it. And the one idea I'd throw out there is that a lot of it has to do with how much you're paying per carbon, or per ton, say. If you pay 1 cent per ton, it's more like a prize. You don't run into all the problems about high-powered incentives. You don't run into huge problems about waste of money or whatever, this other stuff. If you pay $2, $30, you know, something that's more, then you start running into these other issues. But if you started an international payment that was completely separated from the inputs and was just, you know, 1 cent, 5 cents, whatever, with a plan that over 5 years that was going to start scaling up, then initially it would look like a prize. People would start seeing how it worked. The money would be the early money the governments could start using for their own efforts to do this. But again, everybody would be focused on that number, the deforestation rate. Is it going up? Is it going down? How is it going? And then the rest of it becomes, after the fact, separate problem solving at the local level. So I'm a strong advocate for pulling these two things apart.
That's a good and clear recommendation. So continuing what we do, but introducing a very low payment that gradually stepped up, that is irrespective of what the other things we are doing. Good. Berta, would you like to comment? Can we have hybrids? Are they?
Well, I think that from the example that I presented you in the introduction, you can also consider that kind of a hybrid. But I would like to make a difference between paying for results or different sort of parts of the results chain, let it be outputs, outcomes versus inputs, and when your payments are made, because I think you can be making payments for results before they are achieved. And I think this is what we're trying to, together with our partners in the setting up of this fund, is that there are some upfront investments that we have to make, and this relates to the second point I was making, that we could not afford to go to performance-based payments directly. There are many other things that have to be changed and developed and implemented and learned. So we had to create a framework that was capable of accommodating all of these. Now, it's too early to say how it is going to work, and definitely the lessons that Bill was mentioning about, and what you were saying, that it can turn out to be something really complex and difficult. It's something that we keep in mind. But basically, my point is that we didn't really have a choice. We had to accommodate all these complexities into one thing.
Would you like to comment, or if not, I would like also to pose an additional question. When you're working in Ethiopia, I mean, one thing, if results-based payment, I mean, the logic of that is if there is no result, you don't pay anything. So do you envision the World Bank in a situation where you say to the poor Ethiopian communities, sorry, you did not perform, no dollars from us, or bir? Because just the background for this is, we have blamed the World Bank for being tough on conditionality. And of course, there is Jakob Svensson, a good Swedish economist, now working in the World Bank, found this, that the bank was not indeed very tough on conditionality. And a famous paper saying, how does the disbursement of loans depend on how they met these criteria about policy reforms that Pato mentioned? Now, it turned out there is no difference, no significant difference. So they get as much whether they perform or not. So the World Bank is not as tough as we thought they were. But maybe you will be that with poor farmers of Ethiopia now.
That's really the hot seat here now, especially when you start talking about conditionalities in the World Bank. It's not a... Well, I would say one thing, right? The bank can only be as tough as the donors. The bank is owned by a series of governments, right? And at the end of the day, they make the decisions. And in REDD, it's about that too, because in REDD, I think I see it in terms of risk. Just to go back then to this Ethiopia case and how now we are thinking of it. It's a hybrid, clearly, because that's the thing, right? When you really start doing things on the ground, then it's complex. You need money for the upfront investment, for instance. So you need to find ways of having a source of funding for that. Now, it might be another instrument. That's something we have been discussing. Or it may be the same instrument, and that's how we are envisioning it now, actually, that the financing for the investments that are needed up front, they would be advance payments to the emission reductions. So they are payment for the results, and the results measured as emission reductions. But the donor and the bank through the fund would be willing to take the risk of providing a large amount of advance finance for those activities to be to be implemented. Now the question then is, what happens if performance is not achieved then? So you do spend, I don't know, 30% of your overall envelope of money on advance payments, and then you don't have emission reductions. Who bears the risk? Now, of course, the bank would not get into a deal that, well, at least I think we wouldn't get into a deal where the risk would be with Ethiopia, for instance. So whatever the donor is that is providing this funding would need to be willing to take the risk of providing advance payment and non-delivery. So at least that's how we are seeing it at this stage in this specific case.
And I presume this risk is also an important issue, has been in this performance-based. If you have a forest fire or suddenly agricultural prices are very high, so the pressure increases, there may be good government policies in place, but there is no result, at least compared to a historical level. So risk sharing is clearly a key issue when you set this, when you design performance-based systems. Jose, you have a general comment, or should I pose you a question, a difficult question?
Hope not both.
Both. Now, my difficult question, you mentioned the PES programs in Mexico, and Mexico and Costa Rica has really been forerunners in this. And now one of the critique, and you said also these can be a model for REDD in other countries and so on, but one of the critique has been the low additionality. You're paying them, and it's, well, the research is kind of not unique, it's a bit mixed, but in some cases that the additionality efforts by the landowners has not been there, so it's hard to kind of document the large effect on conserving forest, because you have paid them for doing things they would have done anyway. Do you see that as a major problem? I mean, that's one of the key points in REDD, it should be additional. It's one of the key words. Maybe you could address that a little bit.
Well, I think that the equivalent in REDD would be the risks that we have with not developing appropriate reference levels. In other words, the only reference level or quasi-reference level that we developed for PES was regional targeting of the program that would go to areas that we knew that because of a set of economic and physical conditions were more prone to be transformed than others. Now, having said that, of course, those counterfactual measurements or estimations are always uncertain. They carry a level of uncertainty that you have to bear and hopefully improve over time. And in fact, the targeting of the program has improved over time. In the case of REDD, I guess the lesson learned is that we will have to accept that we may not get a perfect reference level initially, and we'll have to get better and better in terms of best practice developing those baselines that would guarantee additionality. But you're right. I mean, there's always this tension between inputs and outputs when it comes to our sense that, well, it's not fair to pay for something that they would have done anyway, for something that carries almost no additional effort. And it comes back to my comment I wanted to say about the lack of strictness, whether we would actually not pay for lack of performance. And I think it's a very hard question and almost a dilemma, because in the end what we are trying to do is test hypotheses on what would affect the rate of deforestation. It's a complex process. It's not like building a wind farm where you can go and test whether the farm was actually built or not. But you're basically saying, I'm going to make social transformations, changes in the economic context that will give you environmental outcomes. Now, I think a possible way out of that trap is that the social aspects and the economic aspects that you want to change are outcomes in themselves. It's not input-based. It's not the number of schools that you built or the number of hospitals, but it's actually the effective improvements in economic conditions, effective management of forest, or effective improvement in governance. So I think to the extent that we can identify those ancillary outcomes, we can still have a results-based scheme that is able to learn from experiences and adapt to cases where we did everything right. We improved governance, we improved economic conditions, we created better rationale for forest conservation, and for some reason or another, forest got lost, nonetheless lost. So we need to allow ourselves some room to learn from that, but be outcome-based nonetheless.
Yeah. Good. I would like to open for questions from, or comments. It's not, I mean, often it's presented as a Q&A session, as if all the wisdom was on this side of the audience. But any comments or particular questions? But brief, 1 minute max. Starting, I can see Pajero from the first over there, and Doug Boucher, and one from the audience. Eamon, if you would like to rather present it in writing, you're welcome to do that. So let's have 3 first initial questions.
Thank you, Ariel. Imagine that we have 1,000 best brain that can save the world living in an island. And the island is going to sink because of the rise of the seawater. And we are saying that, okay, who can swim to that bigger island will get a prize. But that 1,000 people who can contribute to saving the planet are not all swimmers. Maybe only 5 that can swim, maybe only 10 that can swim. What will happen with the 995 if we are not providing them with the tools to be able to swim to that island and save the world? I mean, this is the payment for performance dilemma that I'm facing here. Because if you're talking only about providing the payment, in whatever form it is, the payment, to those who can swim to that other bigger island, then we are not saving the world. I mean, that is a metaphor on that. My question is in terms of the timing of this, because you're talking about payment. It's not only cash, in my opinion. It's a multi-tier payment and performance. And we're talking about a national payment across country, that may be cash. But when you get from the national to the sub-national to the sub-sub-national, what is needed at the ground may not be cash. Maybe the help and the service to provide the land tenure or the boundary of the forest being cleared, and also other services on the ground that will allow, in accumulation to the higher level, the ability to achieve the reduction of emission. So my first comment on this is that we're talking about payment is not necessarily cash. The need on the ground, the need on the sub-national above the ground can be different, not only by location, but also by time. In the beginning, maybe what is needed by these people on the ground is actually the ability to secure that this is the boundary of my area that I can protect. Later after that, I need more and different kind of things. So payment for performance in my mind, and that is something that we practice in the bilateral relationship with Norway, is actually something that is gradually moving up. And those payment for performance concepts will need to be tailored into that. I will say also that program coordination needs to be in the national level. And we're talking about program coordination at the national level. You can be dealing with a on-budget, on-treasury fund, which is talking about what is the chart of accounts of the country, but also on-budget, off-treasury, whereby your budgeting system in the country is not actually ready for doing REDD. So you need to have recorded in the budget, but spent in a way that is not straight-jacket by the budgeting system of the country. That's number 2 in terms of the payment on budget, off treasury, or even off budget, off treasury, but coordinated at the national level through the programs that is being done. And those coordination at the national level can be done nationally only or by a joint work with a multilateral development bank, with a donor, or whatever it is, but on a steering committee that is multi-stakeholder for that nature. I mean, just comment and perhaps additional point.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Doug Boucher in front.
Yes, I have a question for the economists. I guess you're maybe all economists. About the sort of analogy to payments in everyday life. I think of results-based REDD as basically countries are providing a climate service, a benefit to the world community, and the world community is paying for it. It's paying for the service, paying for the opportunity costs involved. And you know, in daily life, there are some things we pay for before we get the service, and there's some things we pay for after. So you get on the bus, you have to pay before you take the trip, but you go to a restaurant and you eat a meal, you don't have to pay until after you've eaten the meal. And I guess I would ask, you know, economically, what determines when we pay ex ante and what determines when we pay ex post?
That's a clear question. I have another from here or two, so we can take them a first round. It was a few comments from Paharo about swimming to the island, and that performance-based measures is not just cash, and also a question of national coordination. If any would like to pick on that, and then the clear question: when should we pay before, and when should we pay after the result? Any would like to start? Okay. Bill? Oh, let's start. The same.
I guess I wanted to pick up just emphasize two things. We have this tendency to look at a results payment program. It actually happens almost with any time you start developing a project, of thinking that this project has to do absolutely everything. And what I think is really important around, particularly the example of the island, is to think of the REDD payments as something that's a payment across countries at the national level about the forest reduction. It would be like the reward for the people who can actually make it to the island. It doesn't mean that the Red Cross doesn't also have a program teaching people to swim on the side, but that's a separate program. Or if you're worried about risk of prices changing or some kind of forest fires, that's an insurance contingency fund. It's a separate project from the payments. So again, I'm a strong advocate that the payment program, if it's going to be a results payment program, should pay against results. And if you're worried about anything else, about human rights or about capacity or something like that, create separate programs that disperse against whatever they're trying to do. But don't try to mix the two. And then I want to come back to this point about the conditional payments and stuff. This is another kind of thing that I'm not... take this with a big grain of salt because I'm an economist, not a psychologist. But I've observed over the last 20, 30 years or so that there's this incredible optimism bias. And when I was at the IDB doing projects, the project was always most successful the day after we approved the loan. After that, suddenly it started looking a little bit messier. And when you do a results-based payment, you're always doing it on the basis of, here's what we're going to pay when we get success. Here's the strategy for how we're going to get success. And 5 years from now, we're going to be celebrating because we had success. But in fact, that's not the way the world works. And the puzzling thing to me is that you always have to think about the counterfactual. If you withhold a payment before the payments are made, say to the poor Ethiopian farmer, what is the situation? There's no money flowing there at all. Once there's the expectation of a program, suddenly the counterfactual is no longer the zero level. The counterfactual is the $100 that should have gone if the program were successful. So we go through this kind of mind game of shifting what our counterfactual is and what our expectations are just by the way we approve our programs.
Berta?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to react a little bit to Tupac Hero's comment about not only cash incentives and payments. And going back to what I said about the DRC National Fund having a lot larger objective than just emission reductions, and then I mentioned to you that we have this first window where investments will be made into reforms, but I also said that there are also demonstration activities there. And these are, in the terminology that the fund uses, are so-called integrated programs. And again, also, as I mentioned to you earlier, these are the whole national REDD Plus strategy, and the fund is supposed to complement the sustainable rural development strategy of the country. So the integrated programs are framed to become the prototypes of later emission reduction programs, but they are also are conceived in a way so that they also provide sustainable livelihoods to people. And the stage that we are at currently is that we are identifying patterns and dynamics of deforestation and economic patterns that will help us create these models that could be used at later stages. And one of the challenges that we're facing in the design part of this process is then how do you measure the results of these integrated programs, because they fit into our larger results framework that takes into consideration national level reforms that are being financed. So how do you attribute, different results to either national or these area-based based programs within the same results framework and the same national fund. And one of the things that we're thinking about is maybe at the level of the fund, not at the level of the projects, but at the level of the fund, we could think about following impacts outside integrated programs as well, to sort of compare the two and draw further lessons for future activities.
Andre?
Yes, also reacting to Ahero's good metaphor, how to deal with the non-performance. I believe that this is exactly again, in the REDD lingo and the REDD international REDD architecture, the role of the readiness phase. And I think that's exactly what Indonesia has been doing, probably at a much larger scale than most countries. Really engaging at the provincial level, at a strong level, in order to reach, finally, at some point, the district governments and those that can make decision. So, exactly. So we are compensating those that can swim faster, but there is a swimming school still happening. Hopefully, that will teach quickly enough before it sinks. Now, on cash and non-cash, that's something that we have at the bank with the Biocarbon Fund. We have had a lot of experiences in. We have a project in Madagascar, for instance, a REDD project that has just been verified by the VCS, where the payments are made to communities, to the forest associations, but they go to services. And that was their choice. I mean, non-cash, because of local, the local economy, psychology, and all of these things. The important thing is that this was their decision. I mean, they decided to do that, so the whole consultation part of this. Now, another interesting thing, actually, a paper that Letizia and I co-authored a long time ago on the CDM projects, reforestation projects. We looked at 2 cases and where there was the expectation of payments for reforestation. And when we talked to the project participants, the landholders, actually their main drive to participate in the program was not the payments. It was really the possibility of land tenure clarification that came with that, because along with the project there was a whole land clarification thing because of the need of having clarity over carbon rights and so on. So that was actually the main drive, not this expectation of the carbon payments. So you can call it co-benefits, as Jose Carlos had said. In order for you to achieve your end goal, actually you need to deal with these variables that I think, a bit wrongly call co-benefits.
Just on Doug Boucher's comment about the upfront versus the ex-post and the link to performance, I'm probably going to say something that only an economist might say, but I think that's something that can be solved through financial instruments. I think that, let's say we were to issue a REDD bond or a forest bond, which was an instrument that we were actually at some point discussing with the bank, you could resolve the cash flow issue and at the same time retain the performance elements into the equation. So I think it's ultimately something that can be resolved. The only problem is the risk, the perceived risk in something that we haven't tried before, and where there's not enough experience. So probably the pricing on such a bond at the beginning might not be as ideal or as precise as we would like it to be.
And I presume also you, in many cases, because if you have the poor farmers, you need a combination of both some upfront payment when the costs occur, and then also some after payment to provide the incentives to actually do it, so they just don't pocket the money and don't do anything. I have a couple of questions on here, and I take more and I do them at the end, and then I'd like to have some more from the floor. I think it's Desmond, and 2 over there, and this one. Okay, if you're brief, the shorter the more.
Thank you.
And present yourself.
My name is Victor Kavengele, National REDD Coordinator from DRC. I would like to say that one of the most important challenges for payment for performance, especially for African countries, the one called HFLDs, is, at my point of view, the setting of a reference level. Not much has been said about it. As you know, these countries are historically have a historical deforestation rate. So I think that is very important for us as a starting point, that the reference level well set properly. And I know that Jose talked a little about it, but if the reference level is not set properly, there will no incentive, let's say, real payment, or not at all. So it's very important, like we are talking about key lessons and the challenges for REDD Plus, for payment, for performance, to talk about these one important challenge for REDD, for payment, for performance for HFLD's country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and clearly reference level is a key point. Just one, I saw a fantastic tweet about reference level. I just have to say it. Reference level is a benchmark set so low that success is guaranteed. So I don't know. Desmond, over there.
Thank you very much. Desmond McNeil from University of Oslo. 2 comments. The first is to plug my usual suggestion that you use proxy outcomes. That is, you measure drivers, which are much easier to measure. So, for example, in Tanzania, you measure the reduction in consumption of charcoal, which is a very good indicator of deforestation. The other comment relates to the point the first speaker was making. Why don't we have this system of paying sort of 1 cent per ton and then 20 cents on delivery? And in a sense, I guess that's what we actually have. We maybe don't feel comfortable about admitting it. But I think maybe it would be a good thing if we recognized that that's what we have. But the unfortunate aspect of that, it seems to me, is that it makes it, the reality is that this is more of an aid program than a results-based program. Even in Brazil, and I'm sure some people would disagree with that, but in a sense, even in Brazil, it's not a results-based payment in the sense that we agreed what you're going to do, and you have projects from the Amazon Fund which have demonstrated those results, and you're then paid for them. And so I think that what you're describing is in a sense what we already have, and maybe we should recognize that.
Thanks. There were 2 over there, so we can have both, and then we 2 on the back front. I think, yeah, you were the 2 far behind, and then I give you in the next. Well, we have 15 minutes left.
Thank you. This panel has been very interesting and relevant as well. Let me quickly, pose one question. I mean, we've been talking about payment for performance, but then when the time comes for investing those payments, do we have a set of guidelines on the sectors or on the areas where these payments can actually be expended on, or it is open and you can actually expend this money on any sectors or areas? Thank you.
The last question before they reply.
Thank you very much. Simone Lovera, Global Forest Coalition and Sobrevivencia, Paraguay. Of course, the big question is who will pay? And there's so much talk always about other people's money. We're following the negotiations on the new market mechanism. They are not progressing at all. I mean, obviously, markets will not be there in Paris, not in 2020. So everybody's now accepting it will be public fine. It's the Green Climate Fund. Fascinatingly, when the Green Climate Fund board met earlier this month, there was very little enthusiasm about REDD Plus. And only thanks to the Norwegian government, it actually got one of the results-based areas. So, and then I'm so interested about this suggestion to invest in swimming schools. And why don't we use much more of the readiness funding to indeed invest in swimming schools? So that, yesterday night there was a great panel about land tenure. For me, that's the swimming school of REDD. If you settle land tenure in countries like Paraguay, you don't need that big pot of money later on. We can just do it even without a lot of money later on. But UNRED and the FCPF keep on forcing countries like Paraguay to, use all this readiness money for building up this system for this big pot of money that might come later, instead of investing in the swimming schools. So how can UNRED and FCPF, make sure that countries use the money they have at this moment to invest in the swimming school, in the land tenure?
So there were questions about reference level, about proxies, about when payments will appear, and then who should pay, and also, and that includes payment for the swimming school. Anyone to pick up on this? Maybe a couple of these each, so you don't need to address all four. Andres, you start.
Yeah, no, I'll start. I will not go into Victor's point at all. That's the thorniest one, in my opinion, and I agree with him. I mean, unless that issue is just looked at, I mean, countries like the Congo Basin, how will they participate? Now, on the issue of proxy, the use of proxies, I think that's exactly what I was arguing for in the case of Ethiopia, for instance. Now, I think the most difficult thing is getting the theory of change right, picking the right proxies. And for that, we really know the drivers of deforestation. And it's very funny because it seems that we are always going back to this and spending more money into analysis. But when you go really to the more local context, we often really don't know still the quantity of deforestation and really the drivers, because at that stage, we need to leave rhetoric. We need to do agricultural intensification. Okay, right, but where, how much, with what farmers, and so on. And then we need more data. But that's fully agreed. Now on readiness, yeah, who will pay? I mean, there actually was, I think, Agos just left, but that was his comment when we were discussing this presentation. You need to actually ask that question. At the end of the day, we discuss all of these results-based finance, but then where is the finance, the big finance? Now, on readiness, I mean, I think what the FCPF and UNRED is trying to do is follow what has been agreed internationally, and we're sticking to that, which is the pillars of readiness. I mean, that's what's happening.
Okay.
I think just a quick comment on proxies, because I think they are relevant. I think we have to use them, but we have to use them with caution and without losing sight of the ultimate performance goals. And there are many examples of that. We in Mexico, we're learning now the hard way, because we did have, for instance, a program to replace air conditioning stock and fridges, thinking that the efficiency of the stock was a key variable and a key proxy for performance. We ended up discovering that households bought larger fridges and run their air conditioning longer. So in terms of the fridge program, we ended up paying about $500 per ton of carbon avoided, and there was no benefit from air conditioning. In the case of charcoal, I would argue, yes, probably under the short-term circumstances is a good proxy, but what about sustainable production of charcoal to the extent that the circumstances of production change? And if you tie your proxy to charcoal, you are inhibiting a possible response that would involve sustainably producing and using the forest. So I'd say proxies, yes, but handled with care and not without losing sight of ultimate goals.
Yeah, Bill?
I want to answer the question was asked, what happens to the payments once they're made? Are they constrained to be spent on specific things? And in a pure results-based program, there's no constraint on how the money's used. It's like general budget support. It's a payment to the Treasury. So that's fairly straightforward, and it's essentially what I'm advocating in terms of separating the outcome payments from the input programs. And in terms of the reference level, what we found education was the first sector that we looked at for this kind of program. And what we did was we convened a meeting of education experts and some outside people so that we didn't have just the same internal discussion going on over and over again. Those kinds of questions, the reference level, the amount, how it's verified. That's the core of any good outcome payment program. That's where the focus has to be. It seems to me there's already fairly advanced discussion on this in the environment field. I'm not going to comment on that, but that's the kind of question that you need to ask when you're trying to design a good outcome-based program. And finally, on this point about who will pay, this is predicated on the idea that somebody cares about paying for the opportunity cost of keeping the, or as you put it, as they put it, the living tree is worth more than the dead tree. So I don't see it as how I put it. Again, I don't see the swimming schools, the land tenure projects, as being hostage to the outcome payment program. Those are to me, those are two separate things. They both need to go forward, but don't try to push the logic of one kind of program onto the logic of the other.
Thanks. Better you do.
Yes, just very quickly, a point on national approaches and national ownership, because I think that can very much mitigate some of the risks and the issues that we're talking about. The eventual unfairness of the payments, we don't know when they're coming, we don't know what we're paying for exactly, about reference levels, etc. I think it's very important to have national approaches and national ownership to integrate this complicated REDD structure into sectoral development plans and elevate it at a highest level. And one of the things that we're trying to do as UNDP in the countries is identify those players in the ministries, in the prime minister's offices who are in charge of these, and trying to sort of make it sure that REDD Plus seeps through these processes. And I think that's part of not only just national approach, but then national ownership, that it becomes, it's not just an expectation of outside funding, and it's not something that actually is forced upon people or is based on what has been promised, but that it also becomes their own, so they're willing to invest into this. And very interestingly, 2 days ago, just before this workshop, we had a workshop with about a dozen countries where we discussed financing modalities, national funds, etc. And one of the issues that came up during the discussion is how do you structure then the domestic resources that you would like to put it into REDD, how that qualifies for REDD Plus, or is it just a sector investment plan in agriculture? So would that go into your national fund if you create that? How to make sure that you don't spend 10 times as much on drivers in a parallel development fund while you're trying to do REDD?
3 minutes left. We have one that raised his hand over there, and then a quick question in front here. So maybe do that, and then yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Oslo REDD, and I'm born here, but I work in the UK. I'm a specialist in solving problems in the industry. I mean, multitask problems. So I deliver solutions, but what you can see is a machine or a chain of technology. So when that is funded, any customers, national, whatever the money comes from, I demand an upfront payment to secure my interest, which is the development phase, which you are talking about, which is about 30%. And then when it's done, it's delivered, when you can see it, when you can test it, and it's proven it does work, I get 50%. And then it goes a while, it has to be proved it works, and it delivers the results they bought, because they buy a solution, they buy an end solution, they don't buy a machine. That's the same you are talking about. And if I should do this one and receive money, which is not the government's money, it's every taxpayer's money, so it should be respected more, in my opinion. And you should demand there is a result on it. And you shouldn't pay anything if you not follow what you have agreed upon up front. And it's just a budget. You find out how much will it cost to develop it on the paper. How much is the production time? What's the delivery? What's the security? What will you do afterwards? And what is the maintenance of it? And you put that into a price, and then if the customer accepts it, he pays it, and he pays up front when it's delivered and the rest when you see it working. Thank you.
Good. I take that as a good comment how to, when the results are there, that you may also recover some of the upfront costs. I was reminded that there are several donor or representatives from donor countries in the audience, and if they would like to make a brief comment on the simple question, why aren't you doing more performance-based payment? In spite of Paris Declaration and other commitments to do that in aid and particularly in REDD. Would you like?
Anyways, I'll take it as an opportunity to
And you
integrate
are?
the two. So I'm Jenny McInnes from the UK, from the Department of Energy and Climate Change. The panel's discussed quite a lot of different ways of integrating upfront finance with pay for performance. And we've talked a bit about additionality in that context. And I'm quite interested to hear, especially from Bill, but from the REDD community as well, how you see that working in the aid environment. So you talk in quite a pure way about the need to separate these programs to keep it focused on the thing that you're trying to do. And I think that's really interesting. And I don't think that's always what we're doing in REDD. But is there not a risk that you're just paying for the same thing twice? And how do we avoid that? Obviously, the reference level is very important. But if you've got a number of different donors implementing different programs in the same place, are we really getting as much bang for buck as we could be?
Any others who would like to, some representing the taxpayers?
Hello, my name is Christiane Eringhaus. I'm with KfW and the REDD Early Movers Program. Karl-Heinz Stecher, who was originally scheduled to be part of this panel, he sends his regrets he couldn't come. But we're here also with GIZ representing the REDD Early Movers Program. And I liked very much the metaphor of the island. I think it appeared several times. The REDD Early Movers Program really rewards the early swimmers, the early movers. We mustn't forget that it's actually very hard to reduce deforestation. And a lot of the early movers have invested up front in reducing deforestation and building up the programs. And in a time where there is no international regime, when there is no clear REDD structure, it's important to provide performance-based compensation for countries who have, or jurisdictions that have, in fact, moved forwards towards reducing emissions. So the way REDD Early Movers works, it has a performance-based payment modality and an incentive payment modality. And it also has a technical support modality and rewards carbon-based on performance-based, but also encourages the countries or jurisdictions to work on benefit-sharing programs where other values apart from carbon can be encouraged, such as conservation values and others. So one good example is the case of Acre, which is presenting next door in the jurisdictional approaches. And if you're more interested in the program, feel free to contact us.
Good. I would also like to pose one of the questions that I also actually had as a follow-up question to particular Bata. You said you're paying for policy reforms is phase 2. Now, give us some good examples of a payment for a policy reforms. And do you say if you do a land reform for 1 million hectares, then you get $65,387?
Well, we expect to pay for policy reforms, but this, again, the national fund has to be put into a larger context. And in the DRC, the government actually engaged on a number of reforms outside the National REDD Fund, which is in the area of land tenure, land use planning, and the development of the mining and oil infrastructure sector with time-bound targets in what is called the Economic Governance Matrix, which is a dialogue, a tool of dialogue between the development partners in the country, represented by the Bretton Woods institutions, and the government represented by the Ministry of Finance. And the implementation of these reforms, which are part of the governance matrix, there are many other targets and indicators, is going to be done through the National REDD Fund. There is technical support activities that will be provided, and the actual reform processes, and this is in the framework of our logical framework that we are currently thinking about what are the kind of reform processes that will be funded from this.
Any last comments, 140 characters each, that you would like to say?
I'd just like to say, always think about the counterfactual. Your point about paying for things twice, the existing programs often pay without getting outcomes. So I'd rather pay for twice and get something than not pay and get, or than pay and for activities that didn't result in anything.
Very good.
And what I was going to say, well, in the case of, for instance, our PES program, we would never be able to mobilize sufficient resources under the existing rules to pay for the opportunity cost of land. What we're doing is actually paying something and combining it with other actions that enable us to reduce the cost of doing it. So I think it's not paying twice, but it's a matter of efficiency in the interventions, how to create better conditions for performance.
Yeah, well, very quickly on the double dipping, and especially because the UK actually is one of the actors in the Ethiopia program. That's why we are trying to structure this as advanced payment emission reductions. Then this question is not there at all, because actually even the investment funding is already the last payment, the down the line payment. Just one comment. I think the very important thing about this whole issue of results-based finance that we didn't talk so much about is the who gets it, and it's really the one that, in my opinion, the one that can make a decision about the factors that drive deforestation. So PES makes a lot of sense when you have deforestation that is led by local landholders, right, making individual decisions. That's not the case in all types of deforestation. For instance, in Indonesia, it's much less the case. Hence, we are talking more about the local governments that have that capacity of allocating or not some forest conversion permits.
Do you have a last 140 character tweetable comment?
No.
That's two. The former Minister of Environment and Development, Norway, used to say we are doing REDD because it's important, not because it's easy, although some might initially have thought that. And I think this just, when you're coming to the core issues, defining performance criteria, reference level, how should you pay, who should pay, these are fundamental questions that we cannot solve in a 1.5-hour session. But I think I've been enlightened about it and gotten some key points. I think also we were reminded several times about this phased approach that is an idea that's now part of the text, and that in a way you shouldn't put all the eggs in one basket, as the financial economy is saying, and even getting Nobel Prizes for saying that. But I think we saw a couple of reasons. One is from the recipient side, that has been a critique of performance-based aid. You want a stable flow of money, so you reach the island, so you don't drown on the way to the island. And thanks, Bahero, now we'll use a lot of that metaphor. But at the same time, you also want to have the incentive, so maybe we have to live with these two systems and think that we can go to a phase 3 where only payment for emission reduction, that's it, but that we can have two systems and how to keep them separate, not messing it up. We had some good suggestions that I think are worth really to consider. And then all the development and the experience that we are gaining. I mean, REDD is, after all, a big experiment that we don't think we have found the solutions, but we should learn from it. And I think in another 5 years we will have even more knowledge about how to do it and how to implement these core ideas that hopefully will make it very different from our past efforts. So thanks a lot and enjoy the coffee.